Chapter 1. Berniece Johnson sat in Josephine's cafe in Beckham, Massachusetts, trying to force herself to smile at the man her parents had chosen for her to marry, Albert Chase. Mr. Chase had been her father's boss for as long as she could remember, but the truth was, he was not a pleasant man. Not at all. "So, your mother tells me that she has employed a seamstress to make you the perfect dress and a trousseau. I adore the color red, so you must be certain that all of your bedclothes are in crimson." Albert smiled at her, and it made her stomach roll. She couldn't imagine going to bed with the man. He was older than her father. "Don't you think it would be better for you if you found a woman closer to your age?" Berniece asked in a whisper. She knew it would offend him, but if she was careful, perhaps he would break their engagement, and she could still have a good relationship with her parents. She dearly wanted them to be happy with her, even though they'd arranged a marriage for her with this odious man. He frowned. "A woman my age would be past her childbearing years, wouldn't she? Are you trying to deprive me of children?" "No, sir. Of course not. But I'm only 19. I cannot imagine you want to be married to a woman who is young enough to be your daughter. Or granddaughter." Berniece kept her voice soft, hoping he would find the words less scathing if she didn't speak them loudly. "You will be punished for those words on our wedding night," he said calmly as he brought his water to his lips. "You need to learn that you cannot talk to your husband that way." His eyes looked positively gleeful that he would have an excuse to punish her, and it made her feel sick all over again. He was not a man any reasonable woman would have chosen for her husband, and she couldn't marry him, but she also couldn't disobey her parents. "I was just suggesting you might be happier with someone else." Berniece was desperately afraid of this man. She couldn't tell what was going through his mind. But whatever it was, it frightened her, and she didn't want to be part of a marriage to him. She didn't want to have to look at him. "Haven't you ever been taught that you shouldn't speak every little thought that pops into your head?" A slow smile crossed his face. "I'm sure I'll enjoy teaching you that." A shudder ripped through her. She couldn't marry this man. Anything would be preferable to a life tied to him. Anything. "I'll be more careful with my words." "Yes, you will." He put his napkin on his plate and stood up. He'd already paid the bill, so he held out his arm for Berniece to take it. Seeing no other option, she slipped her hand into the curve of his arm, fully aware that people were watching them. She tried not to care, but she did. She didn't even want to be seen with this man, let alone be married to him. They left the cafe and walked the short distance toward her home. "I'll work on coming up with just the right punishment for your words. I'll let you know what I've decided on when we see each other Saturday night. Then you can anticipate what will happen to you for the 2 months leading up to our wedding." He seemed extremely proud of his suggestion. She felt like vomiting. Finally, she'd managed to say to him what she thought should be said, and this was his reaction. She could not marry this man. Ever. "All right. I look forward to the day when you are my wife and I can turn you over my knee and paddle you as you deserve. Your parents have been much too lax with you, Berniece." He stopped in front of her house. "Invite me inside." She nodded. "Would you like to come inside, Mr. Chase?" She didn't dare disobey him at this point. "And that adds a little more to whatever punishment I decide upon. I've told you repeatedly to call me Albert." He opened the door and went into the parlor, where both of her parents were sitting. Her father smiled, obviously pleased they were together, while her mother didn't look up from her needlepoint. Berniece sat on one end of the sofa, hoping that Albert would sit on the far end. She'd have chosen a chair, but her parents occupied the only 2 chairs in the room. "Did you have a nice time?" her father asked. Berniece wanted to scream that it had been awful, but she let Albert answer for her instead, which he did as he sat in the middle of the couch, making sure his body was against hers. "You haven't done a very good job of teaching your daughter to be obedient, George." It's going to be my pleasure to teach her how to speak to her husband." The slow smile that crossed his face had Berniece stuffing her fist against her mouth to cover the gag that wanted to erupt. George smiled. "I'm sure you'll take great pleasure in that." He nodded toward Bernice's mother. "I remember teaching Mary the same sorts of lessons when we were first married." He let out a booming laugh. "Sometimes I still spank her, just so she remembers. She doesn't even have to do anything wrong." He smiled at his wife affectionately. "Don't I, Mary?" Mary made a slight nod of her head, still not looking up from her needlepoint. Berniece made a mental note to herself that her mother opposed the marriage. She'd have to find a time to speak with her alone. Perhaps she could convince her mother that this marriage wasn't in her best interests. She couldn't imagine her mother actually helping her get away, because she never defied her father, but maybe she could find some sympathy there at least. Albert laughed as well. "I hope you know that I'll do what it takes to turn Berniece into a good wife." He reached over and covered Bernice's hand with his. "And now we'd like a moment alone for some sparking if you don't mind." Berniece minded. She wanted to scream that she needed her parents to stay, but she knew that would not go over well at all. George nodded. "Come along, Mary." Bernice's mother looked up for the first time since they'd entered the room. Her eyes were blank. "Yes, dear." She followed her husband from the room, not looking even once at her daughter. Albert turned to Berniece. "That's how you'll behave toward me soon. I will not allow your disobedience and rude ways to continue." He gripped her shoulders tightly as he slammed his mouth down onto hers. It was a punishing kiss, and there was no doubt in her mind that it was deliberate for the way she'd spoken to him. When he finished, he grinned and wiped a trace of blood away from her mouth with his finger. "I'll go now. I want you to dream about what punishments you have in store for you, my dear." With those words, he stood up and headed for the door. "Just 2 months until our wedding. I'm counting down the days." As soon as he'd left, Berniece buried her face in her hands and cried. How did her parents expect her to marry that monster? Berniece managed to corner her mother the following morning. She spoke to her softly as they washed the dishes together. "I'm not sure I can marry Mr. Chase. He's not a kind man. Neither is your father. It's a woman's lot in life to marry whatever man her father chooses for her. I tried to talk your father into a man closer to your age who wasn't as cruel, but he refused. You have no choice but to marry him." Her mother handed her a plate to dry. She'd obviously given up on helping her only child. "But, Mama, surely you can see that marrying him would ruin my life. I have bruises on my shoulders from where he squeezed them last night." Her mother closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Berniece, but there's nothing I can do." Berniece nodded. She knew her mother would help her if at all possible, so it must not be possible. "Do you mind if I go to the Mercantile today? I would like to see if I can find a new novel or perhaps a book of poetry." Her reading took her away from her life and transported her to a place that was free of abusive men. She needed another book or 12 to make it through the next week. Her mother nodded. "Of course, you may." After a moment, her mother added, "I wish I could help you, Berniece. I can't, though. Surely you can see that." "I do see that, Mama. Thank you for letting me go to the store." At least she would have a few minutes alone, during which she could walk around town, pretending she was engaged to a man she could actually love. Her imagination was all she had left. An hour later, the dishes were done and her household chores for the day had been accomplished, so she put on a stylish hat and headed to the Mercantile. The store was a 15-minute walk, and she enjoyed every moment of it, passing by people on the streets who didn't know her or only knew her a little. She nodded at everyone as they walked along, in her own little world. At the Mercantile, she lingered in the back, reading all the notices on the bulletin board. Each one of them gave her something to daydream about. One family needed a nanny for their daughter, and she imagined moving in with them and taking care of the little girl while she hid her whereabouts from her family and Albert. It wouldn't work, of course, but the idea was perfectly lovely. At the bottom of the bulletin board was a notice she had seen many times in the past but never actually considered. Mail order bride agency needs women who are looking for the adventure of their lives. Men out west need women to marry. Reply in person at 300 Rock Creek Road. See Mrs. Elizabeth Tandy. She stared at the ad for a full 5 minutes before she chose a book of poetry, paid, and left the mercantile. Instead of heading for home, she walked toward Rock Creek Road, wondering if she'd have the courage to actually go to the door and speak with Mrs. Tandy. She knew she had to try. She had no other choice. A life with Robert Chase was the last thing she wanted or needed in her life. When she got to the door, she took a deep breath and knocked, waiting for someone to answer. A tall blond man stood looking at her for a moment. She fought to get the words past her throat. Usually she wasn't a meek person, but she was so terribly afraid of everything that could go wrong, she couldn't find words. "I'm here to see Mrs. Tandy." "Yes, of course." He opened the door for her. "I'm Bernard Tandy." Leading her down a long hallway to the last room on the left, he knocked softly on the open door. "Elizabeth?" A beautiful woman, who was obviously very pregnant, stood up and walked toward them. "Hello. I'm Elizabeth Tandy. Please come in and have a seat." Then she turned her attention to the man there. "Would you bring us some tea and cookies? I have a feeling we have a lot to talk about." Bernard smiled and nodded. "I'll see to it." Elizabeth returned to the seat behind the desk and slowly lowered herself into her chair. She waited for a moment for Berniece to say something, but finally she spoke after a long silence. "You're here about the ad?" Berniece nodded. "I am." She was glad there was no one listening to them as she leaned forward earnestly. "I'm in desperate need of your help. My father is forcing me to marry a man who is more than 30 years older than I am. I suggested he marry someone closer to his age, and he's talked about nothing but punishing me since. I have bruises on my shoulders, and he made my lip bleed last night when he kissed me." She shook her head. "He actually seemed pleased to see the blood. I cannot spend my life with a man like that." Elizabeth frowned, shaking her head. "No, you can't. How will your parents feel about you marrying someone else, though? They won't allow it. That's why I need to find a way to get out. I'll have to leave in the dead of night. Well, my mother probably wouldn't say anything if I left during the day, but my father isn't much different than Albert." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Albert Chase?" "Yes, I take it you know him?" "Yes, I do. Unfortunately, I've had business dealings with him." "You're right. You have to leave, and you have to do it quickly." Elizabeth pursed her lips as if thinking about it. "You won't be able to take much. Do you have a carpet bag? If not, I can give you one. You'll want to fill it with only clothing and leave just as soon as we can manage. I'll wait up for you tonight. Pack your things and come here as soon as your parents are asleep." Bernie sagged against the back of the sofa. "I'll have to get out of town quickly. They'll be looking for me." She was so thankful she'd found someone who wanted to help her that she couldn't express it. She wanted to jump up and hug Elizabeth, thanking her for even considering her problem. "Yes, they will." Elizabeth reached for a stack of papers on her desk. "I think I know just the situation for you. My younger sister, Charlie, is married to a man in Montana. His brother needs a wife, and if it doesn't work out between the two of you, Charlie will help you. I know she will." She pulled 2 letters from a stack and handed them to Berniece. "One is from Charlie, and one is from Kane, the man in question. Read them and tell me if Kane sounds like a man you could be happy with." Either way, I'll send you to Charlie, and she'll help you. Berniece read the letter from Charlie first, and she smiled. He sounds like he's a good man. Then she flipped to the letter from Kane, and she frowned. Dear potential bride. I'm looking for a mother for my daughter, who is not quite 6 months old. My wife died in childbirth. I'm not looking for a wife. I've had one, and she's dead. I want someone who will be a mother and nothing more. You will be expected to cook, clean, and care for my child, but there is nothing more that will be expected of you. I will provide you a room of your own. I don't care what you look like or how old you are as long as you're willing to be a mother to my little girl. I am a rancher in Montana, and the winters are brutal. I don't want you to come here looking for a fairy tale ending to your journey, because it won't happen. I'm offering you a life of hard work and little else. If this sounds like what you want in life, then please, come to me. Sincerely, Kane Burton. Reading the letter once more, Berniece shook her head. A woman would have to be truly desperate to respond to this letter. She gave a half laugh. Good for him, I'm that desperate. Should I write him back? Yes, write him. I'll send your letter with mine to my sister. Elizabeth smiled. If you're not able to bring yourself to marry him, I'll make sure Charlie takes care of you. I won't back out of a marriage with him. He's saving me from Mr. Chase. Berniece accepted the writing materials the older woman offered and quickly wrote a letter. When will I leave? I'll make sure that letter goes out in today's post, and you can leave tomorrow or the day after. My parents have a party tomorrow night. It will be easier for me to sneak out during the party than it will while they're sleeping. Elizabeth smiled. That's perfect. I will have one of the bedrooms readied for you, and we'll see to your train ticket today. Thank you so much. Berniece didn't even have the words to express how grateful she was to the other woman for getting her out of the situation she found herself in. She finished her letter and passed it to Elizabeth. I'll see you tomorrow evening, then. Oh, if you can, you need to stay for tea and cookies. I'm sure Bernard will be back with them in a moment. Berniece tilted her head to one side. Is Bernard your husband or your butler? He's both. He started out as my butler and bodyguard, and we married, but he kept doing the butler and bodyguard work. He said he wouldn't know what to do being a man of leisure. The cookies arrived then, and Berniece took one as well as the tea Elizabeth poured into a delicate china cup for her. Thank you. You're very welcome. I took over this business so I could help people like you, and I usually go to the train station with my brides, but I'd rather not walk that far in my condition, Elizabeth said, putting her hand over her stomach. So, I'll tell you what I tell women right before they get on their trains for their journeys. If anything goes wrong with this marriage, and you discover your new husband doesn't treat you properly, you only have to write to me. I will send you a train ticket to come right back. Though, in your case, it might be best if you just talk to my sister. She'll help you. Berniece smiled. Thank you. That's the kind of reassurance I need. There is no doubt in my mind how I would be treated if I stayed here. There's none in mine either. You need to be careful when you marry. Men will take advantage. Elizabeth sighed as she finished her cookie, and Berniece got to her feet. I believe that now our business is finished, I will have Bernard mail these letters for me, and I will take to my bed. Naps have become my new favorite thing with this child weighing so heavily on me. I hope you have many children with little pain, Berniece said. I will see you tomorrow evening. Yes, you will. Be safe, my friend. Elizabeth walked Berniece to the door, frowning after her. As soon as she was out of sight, she turned to Bernard, whom she knew would be behind her. Make sure Albert Chase doesn't follow her when she comes here tomorrow night. I'm afraid this one is going to need an armed escort to the train station. That man is not worthy of her. Bernard shook his head. No, he's not. He wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, his hands resting on her belly. I will mail your letters while you rest. My babe is making you tired. Elizabeth leaned back against him. I do love you, Bernard Tandy. Chapter 2. The following evening, while her parents were attending a party, Berniece took the carpet bag she'd already packed and headed out the back door. She was afraid of being seen, and even though it was past dark, she had to be extremely careful. She wouldn't be surprised if Albert Chase had men watching the house while her parents were away. She'd left her engagement ring on her dresser, along with a note to her parents about leaving rather than marrying Mr. Chase, but she knew it wouldn't be found until the following morning. Her parents wouldn't check on her when they arrived home, and her mother wouldn't look in on her until late in the morning, because she believed she should be able to sleep as late as she wanted until she married and was forced to follow someone else's schedule. She arrived at the Tandy house and knocked on the door, looking over her shoulder. She felt like someone had followed her. She knew it was probably just her nervousness, but she was genuinely afraid. Bernard opened the door to her. Miss Johnson, come in. I've had a room readied for you on the second floor. He led her up the stairs, to a small bedroom. Would you care to have a bath? I can have one drawn for you. Berniece smiled. No, thank you. I just want to sleep. That's understandable. Your train leaves at 8 tomorrow morning, so I will have you woken at 6 if that works for you. She smiled. That meant she would be on the train and most likely out of Massachusetts before her parents realized she was missing. Thank God. That sounds wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Tandy. Please, call me Bernard. Elizabeth will be awake to see you off, and I believe we should head to the station around 7:30. I will be driving you, so there is less chance you will be seen. My wife has given me a hat for you to wear so that it will be hard to recognize you. Thank you. It seems you are well versed in the subterfuge of helping young ladies escape less than desirable circumstances. Once the words were spoken, she realized how he must have come by his experience, and she was saddened. He nodded. Unfortunately, I've had to become good at sneaking around. He looked around her room. Is there anything else I can get for you this evening? There's a bath with a water closet through that door. I'll be fine. Thank you. Berniece closed the door and sat on the edge of her bed. The uncertainty of her future was almost welcome at that moment. At least it meant she couldn't possibly be forced to marry Albert Chase. As she readied herself for bed, she thought about the little girl she was traveling to. A child who needed a mommy. She could be that mommy. Asterisk. The train ride was long and tiresome, and Berniece had never felt quite as alone as she did sitting in her seat and watching the world go by out the window of the train. It was humbling to realize she'd had to flee everything she'd ever known to avoid being married to a terrible man. When the train was finally pulling into the station in Missoula, Montana, Berniece was exhausted. She hadn't slept in days, thanks to the bumpy ride the train offered and the couple who argued nonstop right behind her. She was ready to get off the train, but she wasn't ready to meet her future husband. Getting off the train, she stepped onto the platform, aware that everything she owned was in a bag that she could lift with one hand. She should have more, but she didn't, and it was slightly embarrassing for her to be going to a husband that way. She thought longingly for a moment about the wedding dress and trousseau her mother had commissioned back in Beckham, but that was part of another life. A life she had no desire for and no need for. She looked around her for a moment, wondering where Kane was, but the only person she saw was a young woman holding an infant. Approaching her, she said, "I'm looking for Kane Burton. Do you know where I might find him?" The woman's face lit up. "I'm Charlie Burton." "Are you Berniece?" "Yes, I am." "Oh, thank goodness someone was here to meet me. I was afraid I'd beaten the letters that Elizabeth and I sent here." Berniece felt a wave of relief pass through her. "No Kane?" Charlie shook her head. He's working today. I think he'll come by tonight and meet you, and the two of you will marry tomorrow. The pastor is aware of your arrival. Berniece was relieved not to have to meet Kane immediately, and she looked at the infant in the other woman's arms. And this must be Kane's baby? I'm afraid I don't know her name. It's Ruth. Ruth, this is your new mommy. The baby looked at Berniece, but she was quiet as she stared at her with her big blue eyes. It's nice to meet you, Ruth. She held her hands out for the baby, but the little girl turned and buried her face in Charlie's shoulder. She'll get used to me. Berniece had dreamed of the instant where she would see the baby and the child would immediately know her for her mother. Of course, that was just her imaginings, but she'd hoped the child would at least want to come to her. It's time for her nap, Charlie said by way of explanation. It looks like you could use a nap as well. Is that all you have? She nodded to the bag in Bernice's hand. Yes, I didn't have the ability to bring more. Charlie smiled. I understand completely. Come with me, and I'll show you where you can sleep. Are you sure? I can help around the house or something. You're not here to be my maid. Charlie put the baby into a buggy, and the two of them walked through the streets of Missoula. It's already getting cold as autumn rolls in. I hope you brought a coat. I did. It was one of the few things Berniece had shoved into the carpet bag. She knew she could make new dresses, but a new coat would be a great deal more expensive. Tell me about Kane. Charlie sighed. Well, you know he lost his wife in childbirth. Ruth has stayed with us ever since. We found her a wet nurse who lived with my husband and me. She actually left on a train not 30 minutes ago. She's been the closest thing little Ruth has had to a mother. What was Kane's wife like? I worry I won't be able to measure up. She was very pretty, Charlie said after what seemed like a long pause. Ruth takes after her. Berniece nodded, waiting for more, but when the other woman said nothing else, she moved on. And Kane's ranch? Oh, it's a huge ranch. He raises cattle, but he has chickens and a milk cow as well. You'll be able to get many things you need to cook right there on the ranch. And we do have a well-supplied mercantile for things like flour, sugar, and other cooking staples. Charlie stopped at a large, pretty house. Here we are. I hope you and I will be good friends. She opened the door and let the other woman precede her into the house. Your home is lovely, Berniece said, feeling a little out of place. She hoped Kane didn't have the kind of wealth his brother had. Thank you. I like it a great deal. Abel and I only married about 7 months ago. Marianne and I made up the room she's been sleeping in, and it will be yours tonight and any other night you feel the need to stay in town. Sometimes it's easier to stay here during a storm. She picked the baby up out of the buggy and carried her upstairs, leaving Berniece to follow her. If you're hungry, I can make something up for lunch really quick, but you look a great deal more tired than hungry. I am. I had a sandwich on the train a few hours ago. All I want to do right now is sleep for a few hours. The train ride was awful. Berniece didn't want to complain, but she was so tired, she barely knew what was coming out of her mouth. I've made a train ride that long, and I completely understand. I was with a friend and 2 children, which helped me not feel so lonely, but I can't imagine doing it alone. Charlie shook her head, opening a door to a room with a bed and a crib. I hope you won't mind that the baby sleeps in here. It was easier for her to be in the same room with Marianne. Of course not. I look forward to getting acquainted with her. Berniece felt a pull toward the baby, which pleased her. Even if she never had feelings for the baby's father, at least she would have the opportunity to be a mommy. Did you say your husband's name is Abel? Yes, I'm sure you're thinking what I thought when I met him. The 2 brothers are named Kane and Abel. When I heard, I was appalled. Their father was not a believer, and he thought it would be funny to name them after the brothers from the Bible. They're strange names for brothers, but I promise they love each other. I see. Yes, those are very strange names. What about Kane? Is he a believer? Yes, he is. You don't have any worries there. I'm glad to hear it. Berniece sat down on the bed, rubbing her eyes. How long will the baby nap? Oh, not more than an hour or two, Charlie told her. I'll keep an ear out for her, and when she wakes, I'll hurry in and get her. We have her on an infant food mixed with cow's milk. Marianne and I have spent a month teaching her to drink from a bottle, so she could get used to it. What happened to Marianne's child? Berniece asked quietly. Charlie shook her head sadly. She lost her husband in an accident, and a short while later gave birth to a stillborn baby. She came to us the next day, and she has lived with us ever since. She began a correspondence with a childhood sweetheart who lives near her mother, and she's chosen to go back east to live with family. She needs to start a new life, and being a wet nurse was doing nothing toward that. I can see that. Berniece looked over at the baby, who was now lying in her crib sound asleep. Sounds like that little girl has already had a lot of upheaval in her life. I plan to be a constant for her. I'm glad. She and Kane need someone strong to mend their lives. I do hope you'll be patient with him. He's had a very trying time. Of course, I will. Berniece shook her head. His letter made me feel a great deal of sadness for him. Charlie smiled. Elizabeth told me a little about what you had to run away from in Massachusetts. I think you'll find Montana very healing. I know I have. She got to her feet and went to the door. I'll see you when you wake up or when the baby wakes up. Please don't worry about getting up to care for her, because I'll do it. You need to rest up for being a mother. Berniece nodded, curling into a ball on her side, not bothering to remove any of her clothing. What she needed the most was sleep, and it came soon after she closed her eyes. Asterisk. When Berniece woke, it was already getting dark. She sat up straight in the bed she'd been given and got to her feet. The baby was out of her crib, and she was mortified that she'd slept through her crying. She went to the pitcher and bowl and splashed water on her face, fixing her hair in the attached mirror. Then she hurried downstairs, hoping Charlie wouldn't think poorly of her. She found the other woman in the kitchen with two men, one of whom was holding the baby. I'm so sorry for sleeping that long. I meant to wake up when the baby cried, but I must have slept through it. Charlie turned from the stove, where she had a huge pot of stew cooking. Don't worry about it. I know how exhausting that train is. She smiled over her shoulder at Berniece. This is my husband Abel, and his brother, Kane, is the one holding the baby. Berniece nodded first at Abel and then at Kane. It's nice to meet you both. I'm sorry I wasn't awake when you got here. Abel laughed. You've got to be exhausted after traveling so far. Charlie didn't mind. Kane merely nodded at her, seeming to study her. He held the baby against his chest, as if he wanted to protect her from the world. I was tired, but now I probably won't sleep tonight, Berniece said with a self-deprecating laugh. I should have asked you to wake me after an hour or two. Charlie shrugged. I wouldn't have done it. I could see you needed your sleep. She turned from the stove. And supper's ready. I hope you're hungry. Both of the men walked toward the dining room, and Kane put the baby into a high chair. When Charlie came in, she put a piece of bread crust onto the tray for the baby. Berniece carried 2 bowls to the table, feeling as if she should have helped with the meal. Charlie came in right after her, carrying 2 more bowls of stew, and then hurried out for a cutting board with a loaf of bread and a small ball of butter. Berniece sat with the others, feeling inept and out of place. She hated that she'd slept so long. As soon as they were all seated, Abel said a quick prayer, and then the 4 of them ate while the baby chomped at the heel of the bread. How was your trip? Abel asked Berniece, and she quickly swallowed her bite of stew to answer him. It was long and tedious. I wish I'd had time to get a few books for the journey, but there was no way I could do that and get on a train when I did. Kane looked at her, speaking for the first time. I'm glad you came when you did. I wouldn't have wanted Charlie to feel burdened taking care of the baby on her own. Charlie sighed. I've told you 100 times that Ruth will never be a burden for me. I couldn't love her more if she were my own. Kane smiled at his sister-in-law. Thank you for treating her as if she was your own. It's a great deal more than I should have expected from my brother's wife. He looked over at Berniece as if sizing her up. And you'll take on the burden of caring for her now. Charlie shouldn't feel the need to step in at all. Berniece nodded. I plan to. I feel badly that I slept so long, but I didn't get any sleep on the train. She hoped he wasn't judging her for not helping with the baby and with supper, but she felt as if he was. Be that as it may, whether you sleep or not, the baby is now your responsibility. Berniece felt as if she'd been put in her place. She hoped he wasn't the kind of man who would insist on punishing her as Albert Chase would have. I won't let sleep keep me from my duties again. See that you don't. Kane resumed eating, but he kept watching Berniece, as if he was expecting her to get up and dance a jig or do something else equally interesting. Charlie looked back and forth between the two of them, looking a little uncomfortable. The pastor is willing to do the wedding at 2 tomorrow afternoon. I thought we could do a small meal hereafter, if you don't mind, Kane. I don't mind. Berniece smiled. I would love to help you prepare the meal. Charlie smiled and nodded. That sounds good. It'll be nice to have a sister around again. Abel smiled. I'm closing my shop at 1 tomorrow so that I can be there for your wedding. I'm excited to see you finally married off to a good woman. Berniece thought Abel had emphasized the word good for a moment, but decided she must be imagining things. There was no way Abel could be saying Kane's first wife hadn't been a good woman, could there? I'll do my best to live up to expectations. Berniece had been cooking and helping her mother around the house since she was a little girl. She had no doubt that she would do just fine once she'd slept enough. After supper, Berniece helped clear the table, and she washed the dishes. She was surprised when Charlie didn't join her, but Kane came in. I just want you to know that you will need to pull your weight. I'm not marrying you to add another burden to my life. You'll cook, clean, and mind the baby, no matter whether you feel like doing it or not. Berniece frowned at him. I have no problem doing those things. I just got no sleep on the train. If Charlie had woken me, I'd have helped her with no problem. She felt like Kane was judging her as lazy without ever giving her a chance to prove she wasn't like he thought she was. Then make sure she knows to wake you when it's time to do the chores in the morning. I don't want to hear that you didn't help at all. With those words, he left the room. Berniece felt as if she was an inch tall. How could a man she'd never met make her feel so badly about herself? He wasn't 50, but she wasn't sure he was better than Albert in any other way. When she joined Charlie and Abel in the parlor, it was to find that Kane had already left for the night. Berniece wasn't sure what his problem was, but he was making it clear she wasn't there to be his wife. She was only there to cook and clean and take care of his child. Nothing more. She'd gotten the same feeling from his letter, but somehow, she'd been sure it would all work out in the end. Now she was much more certain she would spend her life unloved. Chapter 3. Berniece woke early the following day, and she hurried downstairs to help with the preparations for the wedding. The baby was still sleeping, but she promised herself she'd be the one to get her out of bed and change her. She found Charlie in the kitchen, humming as she mixed up the batter for a cake. How can I help? She asked. Charlie smiled. Well, let's see. I'm planning on making roast beef for our after-wedding meal, so if you want to get that into the oven, that would be wonderful. She nodded her head toward the icebox. No problem. Berniece dug around until she found a large baking dish and put the pot roast into the oven. Are we doing potatoes and carrots? She asked. Well, of course. But let's not peel those until shortly before the wedding. Charlie poured the batter into a cake pan. Now, let's talk about the baby. I'm assuming you're experienced enough with babies to at least know how to change a diaper. Berniece nodded. I've changed many at the orphanage in Beckham. I volunteered there before my father arranged my marriage, and I was expected to spend every waking moment planning for my wedding day. Good. I'm glad you've at least got some experience with babies. Let me show you how we mix her milk. Charlie led her to the sink and showed her the process. I warm the milk in a pan, but just so it's my body temperature, and then we pour it into a bottle for her. Charlie demonstrated as she explained. Now, we're ready for her when she wakes up, and if she's true to form, it'll be within the next 10 minutes. That child has herself on a schedule, and she likes it that way. Charlie put some oatmeal into bowls for them both. Now we eat, while we wait for her to cry. Does she eat oatmeal? Berniece asked. Yes, but she has to be fed. She can eat things like a crust of bread by herself, because she's really just gnawing on it, but actual food we want inside her needs to be spoon-fed. That makes sense. Berniece heard the baby cry, and she got to her feet. I want to start taking care of her with you here, so you can let me know if I need to do anything differently. Kane made it clear that she's my responsibility and mine alone. I'm sure he did, Charlie said, shaking her head. Don't worry about him. He'll come around. Berniece hurried out of the kitchen, feeling a tear pop into her eye. She'd escaped a terrible situation, and she knew she should be grateful for this opportunity, but she still felt very vulnerable. When she got to the room she'd slept in, she picked the baby up and patted her back. I'm here, Ruth. Everything will be all right. The baby watched her warily as she changed her diaper, probably wondering why this new person was taking care of her. Berniece diapered her and carried her downstairs, talking to her softly. Are you hungry? You're Auntie Charlie, and I made you a bottle. When she got to the kitchen, she picked up the bottle and fed the little girl. Ruth sucked at the bottle as if she'd been doing it her entire life, and Berniece smiled down at her. She takes the bottle well. She didn't at first, Charlie said, smiling at her niece. She had to learn. She loved nursing, and taking that bottle made her very angry at first. The past month has been rough as we've taught her to take only the bottle. Marianne needed to be free to go home. I'm sure you miss her. Berniece stared down at the little girl in her arms. I do. I didn't expect to become as close to her as I did, and I'll be forever grateful she was here with me through Ruth's first months. When she decided to leave, I knew I had to write Elizabeth and get her to find someone to marry Kane. He was resistant, not wanting to marry so soon, but I think he knows it's the right thing for Ruth. He doesn't seem to want me around at all, Berniece said sadly. His relationship with Veronica was tumultuous, and I think you'll find that he warms up to you as the days go by. Just be the best mother and housewife you can be, and things will all work out. Tumultuous? Berniece wasn't sure Charlie knew what she was talking about. From his letter, it seemed to her that Kane was still infatuated with his late wife. I hope so, Berniece said, sitting the baby up and burping her. It's going to be strange to be married to a man who doesn't want me there. I was afraid I'd be married to a man who wanted me too much. Charlie frowned. Lizard Breath said you were supposed to marry a man who disgusts you. I hope you don't feel the same way about Kane. Berniece had to chuckle at the nickname Charlie used for her sister. He doesn't disgust me, but I feel like I disgust him. I wish I knew what to do to make him realize I'm not lazy. That's what he thinks after I slept all day yesterday. I told him how tired you were after that train ride. I don't know what that man's problem is, but he's going to get a piece of my mind. Berniece shook her head adamantly. No. We need to work it out between us. All right. But I would be happy to intervene if you think it'll help. I think it would just make things worse at this point. After a week or two, he'll get to know me better and see that I'm capable of keeping up with the housework and the baby, and things will be better. I just have to prove myself to him. Berniece shrugged, giving the baby a bite of her oatmeal. Veronica must have been a wonderful housewife, and he's holding me up to her standards. It sounds like she was practically perfect. Charlie choked on her oatmeal, and Berniece gave her a worried look. Are you all right? I'm fine. Charlie took a big drink of her water, swallowing hard. So, do we have a pretty dress for the baby for the wedding? Berniece didn't even have a pretty, new dress for herself, but she had something that would do. Charlie nodded emphatically. I made it myself. It's a beautiful white dress, and she looks darling in it. After breakfast, Berniece put the baby in her high chair with a couple of spoons to make noise with, and she happily pounded away while the two women got ready for their wedding supper. Is it just going to be the four of us? Berniece asked. Yes. Kane doesn't feel right making your wedding a big production, since it hasn't even been a year since Veronica died. Charlie didn't meet Bernice's eyes when she said that, and Berniece felt like there was something she was missing out on, but she had no idea what it could be. Berniece mixed the dough for a loaf of bread while Charlie drank some water. Excuse me, Charlie said, running from the room. When she returned, Berniece looked at her. Are you all right? Morning sickness. I'll be happy when that part of this pregnancy is over. Oh. You're expecting? I had no idea. Berniece was genuinely happy for the other woman. Yes, I am, and I'm thrilled. Ruth needs cousins, don't you think? I do think so. I'm not sure her father will ever agree to brothers and sisters for her. It wasn't just that his first wife had died in childbirth, but he'd made it plain he didn't think much of Berniece. Oh, I think that will change pretty quickly. Kane loves children. He does? Berniece was surprised. It was hard to imagine the man she was going to marry having any kind of positive emotion at all. He seemed very stoic and angry to her. He does. Ruth is the light of his life. You'll see. If he's not with her, he's talking about her. I don't think I've ever seen such a devoted father. Well, with as much as he obviously loved her mother, it makes sense. He probably sees Veronica in little Ruth. Maybe. Charlie didn't sound convinced. It didn't matter, though, because Berniece could see the writing on the wall, and she knew very well where she stood. By the time the men arrived to walk with them to the church, all three girls were dressed in their Sunday best. Berniece loved the look on little Ruth's face when her daddy got there. The baby excitedly tried to dive out of her arms toward her favorite man. She hadn't quite realized there was already such a bond with the two of them living separately, but the girl obviously knew who her father was. Berniece was dressed in navy blue, and her hair was in an intricate knot atop her head, thanks to Charlie's help. As they walked, the two women walked together, and the two men walked ahead of them with Ruth in her father's arms. When they reached the church, Berniece said a silent prayer for strength. She wasn't sure she was doing the right thing, but little Ruth had already captured Bernice's heart, and she had to go through with it. At the front of the church, the pastor quickly went through the ceremony, and Berniece was surprised at how quickly it all went. When Kane was told to kiss his bride, he looked uncertain for a moment before he leaned down and pressed a kiss to Bernice's cheek. She wanted to yell at him for not caring enough to even kiss her properly, but she couldn't. As soon as it was over, they thanked the pastor and made their way back to Abel and Charlie's house, where their feast awaited them. They ate their meal and then had cake, and after Berniece helped Charlie to clean up, Kane went out to hitch up his wagon and bring it around. He and Abel carried the crib and the high chair out to the wagon and then all of the baby's things. Berniece had expected the baby to stay in town for a couple of more days as she and Kane got used to each other, but that wasn't a plan anyone else had. She carried the baby out to the wagon, and he took the child, holding her while Berniece climbed onto the wagon seat. It was her first time to climb up with no help, and she was certain her skirts would become tangled, but she made it up, holding out her hands for the baby. Berniece held Ruth close as Kane climbed up beside her and flicked the leads. Waving goodbye to Charlie, Berniece hoped she would see the other girl often. She'd already formed a bond with Charlie, and she hated the idea of not having her friend close. Kane made the 5-minute drive out into the country in silence, pulling up in front of a pretty 2-story white house. After getting down, he took Ruth, and once Berniece was on the ground beside him, he handed the baby back over. He said nothing else as he worked to carry in the baby's things, leaving her to carry her carpet bag along with the baby. When she stepped foot inside the house, she swallowed hard. It was positively filthy. She didn't even want to let the baby sit anywhere, but then she remembered that the high chair was clean. She put the baby into it and rolled up her sleeves. Cleaning up months' worth of dust and dirt was not how she'd planned to spend her wedding day, but there was truly no choice in the matter. It needed to be done, and so she would do it. She was the wife and new mother, which meant it was now her responsibility. Kane came in after unhitching the wagon and took the baby from the high chair. She started to tell him not to put the baby down until she'd finished cleaning, but he sat with the baby on his lap in a rocking chair. It took her hours, but she got the kitchen clean enough that she felt like she could make meals there that wouldn't make them all ill, and she finally sat down at the table, utterly and completely exhausted. She hadn't had enough sleep all week, and since she'd gotten up that morning, she'd been cooking or cleaning. Surely, he would understand her exhaustion now. "I put the crib in the baby's room upstairs," Kane told her. "Charlie sent home the quilt she'd made for her, so everything in the crib is clean." "Good. I'll tackle everything else tomorrow." He studied her for a moment before nodding. "I'll show you the room that will be yours." He led her up the stairs, still carrying the baby. "This room is hers." He pushed open a door, and the crib was in the room along with a small dresser. There was nothing else in there. She wanted to ask if the baby's mother had made her anything for her room, but she couldn't, because the subject seemed to be taboo. He led her down to another door. "And this will be your room." The room he showed her was covered in dust like the downstairs had been, and she tried not to let her feelings show. The room would need to be cleaned thoroughly before she would feel comfortable sleeping there, but there was nowhere else. She definitely had her work cut out for her. "This room will do nicely." "Thank you." Kane watched his pretty new wife, wondering how she was going to react to the filthy room he designated as hers, but she didn't complain, simply straightening her spine as if she was gearing up for more work. He had misjudged her the day before, and that was obvious now. She was a worker, plain and simple. He thought about apologizing for the way he'd spoken to her, but he found he preferred to leave things as they were. He didn't want them to be on good terms. She was there to take care of his daughter and feed him. Nothing else really mattered. "Good. I try to be on the range by 5:30, so breakfast at 5 would be nice. I will milk the cow and gather eggs at 4:30, so they'll be ready for you to make breakfast." "Sounds good," Berniece said, already wanting to melt into a puddle on the floor as she thought about the long day she would have the next day, getting everything clean to her satisfaction and making sure meals were made. "I need to give the baby her bottle." "Do you need to eat again?" She hoped his answer was no, because she wasn't sure she was up for cooking anything after all she'd done. "Just some scrambled eggs would be nice." "I don't have a lot of food in the house." Berniece nodded. "I'll fix the baby's bottle and your eggs. Bring her down when you're ready to eat, please." "I think she needs her diaper changed," he said, looking at her. "Yes, of course." Berniece took the baby and changed her in her crib, not wanting to lay her on any other surface in the house. After changing Ruth, she handed the girl back to her father and headed down the stairs to make eggs and a bottle. Thankfully, Charlie had sent the infant food the girl needed. After fixing meals for Kane and Ruth, she took the baby from her new husband and fed her, talking to her in an animated voice as she held her. "I'm so glad you like that food, because your new mommy doesn't have the ability to feed you any other way." "No, I don't." Kane watched Berniece with the baby, and he knew she would be a good mother, even though she may not be a good wife. The two of them seemed natural together, and he was pleased to see it. As he plowed through his eggs, his mind was on the two girls in his life. "I'll be home at noon and 6 for meals. I expect them to be hot and ready when I ride up." She nodded. "I'll take care of it. There are several ranch hands, but you won't be expected to feed them at all. Your entire job will be taking care of me and Ruth, feeding us, and making sure the house is clean." "Yes, of course." Berniece wanted to throw something at him, but the only thing she had available was a baby bottle, and she didn't want to have to clean up the glass from the floor. He tipped his head to one side as he watched her. "Whatever you're running away from back east must be pretty horrific if you were willing to marry a man who didn't want a wife." She nodded. "It was. I was expected to marry a man 30 years older than me who was planning ways to punish me for pointing out that he might want a wife closer to his age. He left bruises on my shoulders before we were married. Imagine what he would have done after." Kane frowned. "I'm not perfect, and I won't claim to be. But I promise I will not hurt you. That's all I'm looking for at the moment." With that, she pulled the bottle out of the baby's mouth and burped her. She was glad they understood one another. Chapter 4. Berniece woke before the sun was up the following morning, peeking her head in at the baby before she stumbled down the stairs. She started a fire in the stove and immediately started a small pot of oatmeal for the baby. While that was cooking, she sliced bacon off of the big slab of meat she found in the icebox and started it frying. She located a coffee grinder and started a pot of coffee. She put eggs on to fry as soon as she heard Kane moving around, and then sat down for a moment. The kitchen was the only clean room in the house for now, and that would need to change by the end of the day. She hadn't enjoyed sleeping in the dusty room that had been designated as hers, so she would need to wash all bed linens and get the rooms cleaned that day. Starting out her day in a state of exhaustion wasn't going to help her get the things she needed to do finished. She had breakfast on the table by the time Kane came in from collecting the eggs and milking the cows. He immediately sat down to eat, saying nothing to her as he inhaled his breakfast. She sat with him in silence for a moment. "I'm going to need to do a little shopping before I can do any real cooking," she said softly. He nodded. "I figured that. If you want to walk into town with the baby, that would be fine, or wait for me. I could take an hour to do shopping with you on Monday. I don't know if the food we have on hand will be enough to make it until Monday. We really need several things." He shrugged. "Make do or go on your own. If you decide to go, put the food on my account at the mercantile. Just explain you're my new wife." With that, he stood, plopped his hat on his head, and left for the day. Bernie stared at the closed door, wondering what on earth was wrong with the man. He expected her to cook 3 meals a day, but he expected her to do it with no food. No one could manage that way, not even his perfect Veronica. She had finished the breakfast dishes and given the baby her bottle and was feeding her oatmeal when there came a knock at the door. She was already close to tears, so if it wasn't a neighbor there to bring her a cake to welcome her, she didn't know if she was going to be able to manage not to cry. She hurried to the door and threw it open, finding Charlie on the other side, and much to her chagrin, she did burst into tears immediately. Charlie stepped inside, hugging Berniece. "I'm sure this house is a mess. I thought about coming to clean it before you came, but we were getting ready for Marianne to leave, and I just didn't have time." Berniece nodded, wiping her face with her apron. "What brings you by?" Well, I brought you a loaf of bread, and I figured you would need help around the house today. Getting that much cleaning done while taking care of the baby is going to be difficult. Charlie walked over and picked up the spoon and oatmeal. I'll feed the baby, and you do whatever you need to do next. Thank you. I need to wash bed linens and clean upstairs next, I think. And we need food. I don't know how Kane expects me to cook with no food in the house. You get the laundry on the line, and I'll drive you into town for food. I brought the wagon, thinking you might need to make a trip to the mercantile. Berniece smiled through her tears. You're the best sister-in-law anyone could ever ask for. I'll get to work right now. 2 hours later, the laundry was on the line, and Charlie drove them into town. As soon as they reached the mercantile, she took the sleeping baby from Bernice's arms and waited while she hurried into shop. Berniece walked straight to the counter to speak with the proprietor, who was dusting the shelf, but he looked up when she stopped in front of him. I'm Berniece Burton. I just married Kane. He said you would let me put things on his account. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Burton. I'm Terrence Walker. Feel free to shop. I have no problem charging your husband's account. He returned to his dusting, and she wandered around the store, finding what she needed. She had to start from scratch, because she couldn't find even a cup of flour in the house. He must have gotten rid of everything after Veronica died. It took her more than 30 minutes to choose everything she needed and have it charged to Kane's account. When she was done, Mr. Walker had his son carry everything out to the wagon. After climbing back into the wagon, which was getting much easier on her own with practice, Berniece took the baby back from Charlie. All right. Let's get home so I can have a hot meal on the table at noon as Kane requires. Charlie shook her head. Sounds like he's requiring a lot from you. Oh, he is, but I'll manage. Berniece looked down into the sweet face of the baby sleeping in her arms, and she knew she'd do anything to continue to be allowed to be this baby's mommy. When they reached the house, Berniece sent Charlie in with the baby while she unloaded everything from the wagon. The bag of flour was heavy, and she had a hard time carrying it in, thrown over one shoulder. She dumped the flour inside the door and went back for more. It took her 6 trips to get everything into the house, and she sat down for a moment when she was done. I still need to cook lunch, but I need to catch my breath first. She glanced at the clock on the wall and saw that she had 30 minutes before Kane would be there for lunch. Let me get lunch taken care of. I'll make some bacon sandwiches, and he'll be just fine with that on your first day. Charlie took the baby upstairs and came back down to cook lunch while Berniece started working on the parlor. Thank you for coming to help me today, Berniece said softly. I don't know what I would have done without you. I couldn't have slept in that bed one more night without washing the linens. Charlie nodded. I remember helping Veronica clean this house when she was very pregnant. I'm sure cleaning is hard when you're expecting, yet there you are helping me. Berniece shook her head. I shouldn't let you help, but there is so much to do. Once I'm caught up, I won't need as much help as I do now. I know that. You can help me when the baby is born, Charlie said with a smile. I sure will. Berniece finished sweeping out the parlor, and then she dusted every surface. When she had finished those tasks, she started on the windows, which were filthy like everything else in the house. She had just finished one of the windows and collapsed into a chair when Kane walked in the door. Charlie put food on the table for the 3 of them, and Kane glared at Berniece. I thought I made it clear that you were to be the one doing the work around here and not being a burden on Charlie. Berniece bit her lip against what she wanted to say. There was no way she should open her mouth, because she had no idea what might come out of it at that moment. Charlie set her sandwich down and looked at her brother-in-law. I came here to offer my help, because I had an idea of what the state of this house would be. I'm glad I did, because I was able to help her with the baby and drive her into town for supplies. Shame on you, Kane Burton, expecting your new wife to do things that no woman possibly could. She needed help, and she got it. She's already agreed to help me when my baby is born, so you don't have to worry about her paying me back for it. Kane frowned at Charlie before looking at Berniece. This isn't going to be a habit, though. Is that understood? I didn't ask for help. She came and offered it. Berniece kept her voice even, though she wanted to yell at him. Why did he keep assuming she was lazy? Had he not looked at all that had been done around the house since she'd gotten there? Charlie made lunch, drove me to town, and held the baby. I've done everything else that's been done. He looked around the house, noting that the dust that he'd started to think was permanent was completely gone. The windows had been washed, and the floors had been scrubbed. He'd noticed bed linens hanging on the line as well as diapers. We'll talk about this later. And they would. She deserved an apology. He was painting her with the same brush Veronica had needed to be painted with, and it wasn't fair to her. After lunch, he rode back out to work, but his mind was still on how unfairly he'd treated his wife. He needed to be kinder to her. Bernice's afternoon was filled with more cleaning and cooking supper. She baked some fresh bread and even made a cake for dessert. Charlie helped with the baby, but she was mostly there to keep Bernice company as she worked. When you're all caught up on the house, we can spend a couple of afternoons together every week. We can talk or sew together while the baby sleeps. Bernice smiled, nodding. I would like that a lot. For now, I have a lot of mending to do and so much laundry. I only did diapers and linens today. I'll have a lot more to do on Monday. She was tired, but she felt good about everything she'd accomplished. Her fall cleaning was going to be completely finished within a week, and then she would feel as if she had the right to do what she wanted on the occasional afternoon. I brought you something as a housewarming gift, Charlie said before she left. Let me get it. Bernice waited as Charlie went out to her wagon and brought in something wrapped in a dishcloth. My friend Mary made it, and I think you'll enjoy having it in your home. Carefully unwrapping the package, Bernice cried out with pleasure. Oh, it's beautiful. Did she carve it herself? She turned the wooden sculpture over in her hands, noting that it was a grizzly bear, carefully carved from wood. Yes, she did. She's amazing. Charlie smiled. I came to Montana with her when she needed help, and she and I formed a fast friendship. I think my sister is as much of a friend matcher as she is a matchmaker. Because here you are, and we're friends now, too. Bernice smiled and nodded. We are friends. Thank you for welcoming me with open arms the way you did. I'll never forget the kindness you've shown me. I won't let you, Charlie responded. We're sisters-in-law, and I live just a 5-minute drive from here. With a quick hug, Charlie was on her way, promising to see Bernice at church in a couple of days. Bernice was pleased she'd know at least one other woman who she could talk to. It would be nice to meet her new congregation with a friend at her side. Bernice heard the baby then, and she climbed the stairs, lifting Ruth from her crib. Are you hungry? She asked, changing the baby's diaper. Milk? The baby just looked at her as if she'd lost her mind with her questions, but Bernice noticed that she was settling more comfortably in her arms every time she held her. They would make a great team, her and Ruth, and she would teach her everything a woman needed to know about how to take care of her home. When Kane walked in the door at the end of the day, he smelled fresh baked bread and something more. He walked to the stove and looked into a pot of chicken and dumplings, and his stomach stood up and reminded him of how hungry he was. Sit down, and I'll serve it, Bernice said. I didn't notice you there. I was in the parlor with Ruth. She put the baby into her high chair and served them both a bowl of chicken and dumplings, before carefully fishing out a dumpling for the baby. When she sat down, she waited for Kane to pray over their food, and then she took a small piece of dumpling from the baby's bowl, blew on it, and fed it to the little girl, whose mouth was open and ready. She took turns feeding herself and feeding Ruth. She didn't notice as Kane finished his bowl, but she did see when he got up to serve himself another helping. "I'd have done that for you," she said, not wanting him to accuse her of being lazy again. She was anything but. "You're taking care of the baby. I can refill my own bowl." He sat down, and now that the worst of his hunger was sated, he started the conversation he'd known he needed to have with her since lunchtime. "I want to apologize for being so hard on you. I didn't know that Charlie had come unexpectedly or that you were planning on helping her when the baby came. I just thought you were adding to her duties, and I saw red. I wouldn't. I didn't come out here to be a burden on anyone. That first day when I got off the train, I was so tired, I was stumbling a little when I walked, so when Charlie suggested I take a nap, I jumped at the chance. But I really thought I'd wake when the baby did. I guess I was even more tired than I realized." She shook her head. "But honestly, that's the only time I haven't pulled my own weight since I arrived. I've taken care of Ruth and done all the cleaning you've seen done. Charlie spent most of the day, but she held the baby and entertained her and kept me company while I worked. Will you forgive me for jumping to conclusions?" He thought briefly about telling her how Veronica had been, but he thought better of it. No, it was better if she thought he'd half-worshipped his first wife than she knew the truth of the matter. What if she took that as an invitation to be a wastrel as Veronica had? Berniece nodded. "Thank you for apologizing. It's good to hear that you can see what I've been doing around here." He picked up his fork and started on his second bowl of dumplings, watching how sweet she was with the baby. "Supper is delicious. Where did you learn to cook so well?" She smiled at that. "My mother taught me that the most important skill a woman could have was cooking, and I learned at her side. She also taught me how to sew and clean. We had enough money for a servant when I was growing up, but my father felt like a wife who didn't bother to cook and clean was a waste of space, so Mother always did the chores herself." "Well, I need to write a letter to your mother and thank her, then. This truly is an amazing meal." Berniece frowned. "You know my parents don't know where I am, don't you?" He shook his head. "I know you were running from an engagement you didn't want, but I thought you'd have at least told them where you went." "I couldn't. My father would have dragged me back, kicking and screaming. I promise, this is the only way I could have come." "So, did you sneak out in the middle of the night?" he asked, surprised. "No, but what I did isn't much better. I packed my things, and as soon as my parents went to a party, I left. I did leave them a note along with my engagement ring on the dresser in my room, but they have no idea where I was going or what I was doing. I had no desire to ever even look at that ring again." "Was the match they chose for you that bad?" "Much worse than I can even express. I know they're looking for me, and I pray they never find me." She looked at Ruth as she carefully fed her another bite. "I want so much more for our baby than my parents ever wanted for me." He frowned at her use of our. Already she was seeing little Ruth as her own. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it did make him feel just a tad bit guiltier. Berniece was a better mother than Veronica ever would have been. There was no doubt in his mind. And how was he supposed to not feel guilty for knowing that? Veronica hadn't wanted the thing growing inside her. And here Berniece was willing to take on the burden of another woman's child without second thought. Chapter 5. Berniece woke up the following morning, aching in every part of her body. She rolled out of bed and dressed in the dark, knowing she needed to keep going even though she wanted nothing more than to give up. If only Kane acted like he appreciated all the hard work she did, things would be easier. At least he'd apologized for acting like she was lazy, but she was fed up with the situation, after only a couple of days. She checked on the baby before going downstairs to start breakfast. Now that she had fresh bread, she'd do bacon, eggs, and toast. At least she had a little bit of butter Charlie had brought with the bread the day before. She started the fire in the stove and ground the coffee beans, her arm aching with every turn of the crank. She was surprised at just how much it hurt until she thought about all she'd done the day before. The house was almost completely put to rights, because she'd worked from the moment she'd woken up until she'd gone to sleep. Maybe Kane had apologized for assuming she was lazy, but he certainly hadn't thanked her for cleaning up almost an entire year's worth of dust and dirt. She hoped it was only a year. Veronica may have been a slob, but from the way Kane talked, that would be hard for her to believe. Pushing through the pain, she took her anger out on the coffee beans. She knew the man wouldn't hit her, so she wasn't afraid of him, and she also wasn't afraid to feel her emotions. She went to the stove, put a frying pan on it, and waited as it heated up. Cutting off pieces of bacon, she threw them into the pan, hoping that Kane would choke on the breakfast she was making him. That would serve him right. She cut off pieces of bread and buttered them, putting them on a baking sheet and sliding them into the oven, getting angrier and angrier each time she felt a twinge of soreness float through her. She was putting herself in physical pain for him and his daughter, and he couldn't even be appreciative of all she was doing? Yes, choking sounded like a fitting punishment. When he walked through the kitchen to get the milk and eggs, she refused to even look at him. His handsome face didn't even begin to make up for his terrible attitude. She understood that he was still hurting from the death of his wife, but to treat her like she was second class? That was unacceptable from that moment going forward. No longer would she put up with it. She didn't want little Ruth to learn that it was all right for a husband to disrespect his wife. Berniece took up the bacon and poured a mixture of milk and eggs into the pan, cooking the scrambled eggs in the bacon grease. Just as Kane stomped back into the house, she put his food on a plate and pulled the toast from the oven, slapping that on there as well. "Coffee?" she asked, hearing the harshness of her own voice. "Yes." "No, please." "No, thank you." Just yes. The man needed to learn some manners, and she was just the woman to teach him. She poured him a cup of coffee and then got her own plate ready. Truly, he was driving her absolutely crazy, and he'd only said one word to her all morning. She sat down and took a bite of her bacon, spotting an eggshell in the eggs. She knew she should apologize, but she was beyond that. She couldn't even speak to the man without exploding at the moment. Kane looked at his wife warily, wondering what bee was in her bonnet. He'd thought they'd mended things between them the night before, and here she was, angry with him for something, and he didn't even know what it could be. He poked his eggs with his fork and saw an eggshell. Her cooking the day before had been perfect. Had she left shells in on purpose? There are shells in the eggs. Berniece closed her eyes and counted to 10. But there's no poison in them, so you should be thanking me. His eyes widened. You're thinking about poisoning me? Why on earth would she be angry with him? He'd apologized for his bad behavior, and he was treating her well. It's what you deserve. Do you have any idea how many hours I spent yesterday putting this house to rights? My entire body aches from all I did, and you never even once said thank you, and instead you complained that I had someone here helping me. I don't know what your problem is, but I will not be your whipping girl. I'm here to be a mother to your daughter and to take care of your house and your meals. I don't even get a real marriage out of it. I'm more or less an unpaid servant in this home. And you can't even thank me for the work I do without pay? I will not put up with that type of behavior any longer. Berniece was shaking with anger by the time she finished her tirade, and she took a sip of milk to cool herself off. I apologize to you for my assumptions. What more do you want from me? Kane felt his own temper rising to meet hers. She was being absolutely unreasonable. I want thanks for all I do. Thanks for taking care of your child and cleaning and cooking. Thanks for working so hard to make you happy. Berniece chomped on a bite of her bacon. And I want you to stop glaring at me as if you think I'm here trying to usurp your precious Veronica. Veronica's name felt like a slap in the face to Kane. It's not like you're not getting anything out of this arrangement. Remember that man your parents wanted you to marry? He's not beating on you, and you never have to look at him again. You're doing what you would have done married to him, but you're doing it without being hurt. And that should make me content, should it? I am doing everything I came here to do, and I feel like I've done it all with a good attitude. But I'm sick and tired of you not even thanking me for working so hard and cleaning up the mess of almost a year. I deserve that, not just the cold shoulder, which is all I get from you." The last words were almost a scream, and in response, she heard a cry from upstairs. "Now look what you did. You woke the baby." She got up and hurried up the stairs to take care of Ruth, leaving him sitting there, picking the shells out of his eggs. By the time she had changed the baby and dressed her for the day, Kane was gone. She wanted to scream at him some more, but she knew it wasn't a good idea with the baby watching. The child needed to feel like she lived in a home with love in the air, whether she did or not. She fed the baby and washed the dishes, before sweeping the kitchen floor. She was actually relieved that Kane left before she got back down, because she couldn't keep badgering him about his behavior, no matter how much she wanted to. Making a pot of chicken, vegetable, and barley soup was easy enough, and they would have it for lunch. She could even feed some bites of it to the baby. She felt like she was constantly thinking about the best things to feed the baby, because Ruth had to be her focus. She thought for a moment about doing the rest of the laundry, but her arms needed the rest. She would do it all on Monday, and that would become her routine. Laundry every Monday. She'd already looked at the basement and found there was a spot to hang a clothesline there for snowy or rainy days. She was a little surprised not to find one there already. She baked a couple of fresh loaves of bread for the day, and she planned to serve one with the soup for lunch. Then she sat on the sofa in the parlor, with the baby lying on a quilt on the floor, and she worked on mending the clothes that Kane had thrown into a basket to be dealt with later. She couldn't believe how many things were there that needed to be worked on, but she started on one thing on the top of the heap. If she could mend one item per day and keep up with the baby and other household chores, she would consider it good. The baby gurgled happily while Berniece sewed, and she was thrilled that Ruth was such a good baby. If she had been a fussy baby, she wasn't sure how she would have handled it. When it was time for lunch, she served 2 bowls of the soup and cut up some of the bread, adding a small ball of butter. She would need to make butter as soon as her arms were recovered enough from all the other work she'd done. Berniece looked up when Kane came in the door at 12:05. She had a bowl of soup in front of her that she hadn't yet touched, and she was feeding the baby small bites out of another bowl. Kane sat down at the end of the table and bowed his head to say grace. He frowned down at the soup. "I prefer something heartier than soup for lunch with as hard as I work." Berniece glared at him. "I think you'll find that my soup is very hearty." She couldn't believe after their talk that morning he was still being rude. He took a bite of the soup, blowing on it first. He was surprised by all of the chicken, vegetables, and barley in the soup. "I guess it's not too bad." "Not too bad? Is that how you compliment someone's cooking?" she asked. He could easily have said something kinder, but he was too sure of himself to bother. He shrugged. "I guess I don't think you need to be complimented for doing your job." His slight emphasis on the word job had her ready to start screaming all over again. Berniece bit her lip to keep from saying what she really wanted to, but she knew yelling at him with the baby present was not something she wanted to start now, because she wasn't sure she could go back. Instead, she started to plan her escape for the afternoon. As soon as he was gone, she put the last of the soup into the icebox, and she cleaned the kitchen. She knew she'd be coming back, and she wasn't about to return to the filth she'd had when she arrived 2 days prior. Once the kitchen was clean, she went upstairs and packed enough things for her and Ruth to stay a couple of nights with Charlie and Abel. She had to get away from the man, so he could appreciate all she'd done. She put the clothes they needed in the empty space at Ruth's feet in her buggy, and then she added some clothes that needed to be mended. She couldn't sit around idly while she was in town, no matter how much she wanted to or how much Kane thought that was her desire. She scrawled a quick note to him. Kane, Ruth and I will be in town for a couple of nights. There are plenty of leftovers in the icebox for you to eat. When you're ready to be appreciative of all I do, please come and fetch us from your brother's house. Berniece. Walking to town was actually very nice for her. The cool September breeze and the beauty of the area she lived in made her feel so much better about how things were going. It was good to be able to walk and let her thoughts flow freely from one topic to the next. Her and Ruth leaving for a while would be a wake-up call that Kane dearly needed, and hopefully he would understand where she was coming from. When she reached Charlie's house, her friend was there with a wide grin. I'm so glad you came to visit. Berniece stepped inside, pushing the baby's buggy into the entryway. I'm hoping we can stay for a night or two. Kane and I have had a couple of run-ins today, and I think he needs to be taught how to treat a lady. I think you're exactly right. I heard how he talked to you yesterday, and I was appalled. Charlie looked down into the buggy at the sleeping child and smiled widely. I'm so glad you brought the baby. You have no idea how much I've been missing having her here. I keep listening for her cry, and it never comes, because she doesn't live here anymore. Charlie shook her head. I brought mending to do, so I wouldn't just be sitting idle. And I'm happy to help you with supper or anything you need. I'm not trying to get out of working, but I am trying to get away from the constant arguing. Berniece didn't think her new friend shared her husband's views of her, but she had to make sure. Of course. Charlie made a face. I hate mending, so I have a nice little pile myself. Why don't we sit together and work? That sounds lovely. I love little Ruth, but she isn't the best conversationalist while I'm working on something. Berniece had taken to singing while she worked, because the baby reacted well to it. Charlie grinned. Yeah, until she starts talking, work will be a little lonely. But then, if she's like my younger siblings, once she starts talking, you'll want her to stop. Quickly. Berniece laughed. I have no younger siblings, so I'm unaware of feeling that way. I hope Ruth won't always be an only child. She bit her lip after that. She didn't know if Charlie knew that she and Kane hadn't consummated their marriage and probably never would. Charlie shook her head. Kane is going to come around, you know. He's a good man, but he got a raw deal with Veronica. He just needs to see that you're not like her, and everything will be better. Wait, what? I thought Veronica was this paragon of female virtues. He won't even talk about her, and that makes me feel like she was so perfect, he can't deal with a day without her. Not at all. I shouldn't have said as much as I did, and I'm not going to say more, but Kane needs to tell you all of it when he's ready. Just keep being kind to him, and things will look up. Berniece frowned, looking at her hands. I guess leaving shells in his eggs and yelling at him like a shrew this morning didn't help anything. Charlie threw back her head and laughed. Maybe it will wake him up and cause him to see you for you and not taint you with the memories of other women. The way she emphasized other women had Berniece grinning. I guess I need to be more patient with him and stop being a brat. I wish he appreciated something I did. Anything I did. He never once thanked me for all the work I've done since I arrived, and I ache from it. He did apologize last night for being rude to me about you being there, though. That helped a little. But he needs to be grateful as well. I think you letting him know what you need in a husband can only be a good thing. I hope so. Ruth made a noise, and Berniece gathered her up immediately. Oh no. I forgot her bottles and infant food. Charlie smiled. I kept some here. I knew you'd be visiting, and it will be easier than taking everything back and forth. You know, I may not have the best marriage right now, but marrying Kane gave me the mother lode of sisters-in-law. I'm grateful to you and the help you are to me and little Ruth. Thank you for being you. Happy to do it. And honestly, I'm sure you and Kane are going to be happy. It's just a matter of you working together to get through this rough time at the beginning. You're going to make things work. I just know it. You're the sister-in-law I need as well. With those words, Charlie went into the kitchen to make a bottle for the baby, while Berniece looked down into her big blue eyes. Are you hungry? Auntie Charlie is making you some milk. Do you want to eat? Ruth gurgled something completely incomprehensible to Berniece, and Berniece smiled. That's right. You just keep talking to me, and I'll figure it out soon enough. I'm so happy to be your new mommy, Ruthie. I can't believe just how happy your little smile makes me. As happy as she was unhappy with Ruth's father. Hopefully soon, the two would meet in the middle and all would be right with the world. She hoped. When Charlie came back with the bottle, she scooped the baby up. I get to feed her. You feed her all the time now. Charlie sat back down and saw to the baby's feeding, while Berniece picked her mending back up. I know you. You're trying to keep from having to do the mending. Charlie nodded emphatically. You figured me out. Berniece grinned as she applied herself to the mending that still needed to be done. She would try and help Charlie with any mending that she needed to do now that she knew how much the other woman hated it. It would be a break for her to go over and let Charlie take care of Ruth while she did her mending for her. Berniece truly didn't mind the task, and she would be happy to help someone who had only shown her love and kindness. As Charlie became involved with the baby, Bernice's mind went back over everything they'd said that day about Veronica and Kane. Hopefully she could get Kane to understand that she was a hard worker and she only wanted to be a good wife to him. If she worked at it enough, he'd start believing her. He had to.